Hi, everybody. Welcome to Inside Scoop with Sue. Today, I'm here with Dr. Adam Price. He's a psychologist and the author of He's Not Lazy, and we love having you on, so thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So, we put out a question to our parents, and we said, what are you worried about with your boys? And the list is, as you can imagine, quite huge and diverse, but we categorize them into like about 6 different categories. So before we get to that, I want to start with, what are you seeing that's different with our boys? If we can call this post-COVID, what are the manifestations for the kids who were isolated at home and are now back in school? Is it harder for boys than it was what you used to see, or different?
Yeah, Susan, it's a good question and a huge concern. I was a couple of weeks ago, I was doing a day-long thing at a school, independent boys' school in the city, in New York City. Where I addressed the parents and the teachers, but I really got some time to talk to the boys, and I was really surprised because the teachers, the administration, the teachers were saying they're still struggling, even though they were only shut down for a short period of time. To get the boys back in terms of their social emotional growth. They feel like they're more immature, they're more rowdy than they used to be. It's really, there's academic issues also, but I think that it really has taken its toll on getting boys, because boys are always a little bit more behind girls, for a lot of reasons that we can go into. But in school they start off. I'm sorry, one second.
Your dog is not liking what you're saying here. Okay, let's just be clear. Is your boy a boy dog or a girl dog?
I have 3 of them, and they're a mother and 2 pups, and one of the pups is a girl, one of the pups is a boy. So yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if boy dogs have any of the same struggles, but your dog is gone now. So let's go back to that.
They're different. The boy dogs are different than the girl dogs, and the boy people are different than the girl people. So yeah. I think that boys have always had more of a challenge in school because, boys and girls' brains, when you look at an adult male and adult female brain, they're almost identical. You can't tell them apart. But when you look at a child's brain, they're different because boys and girls develop the same abilities in different orders. And the order that girls develop is better for school in the early ages than it is for boys. And so oftentimes boys have trouble getting used to school, getting into school. Some get turned off at an early age. Things like sitting still, paying attention, pleasing the teacher, particularly. Are things, a language. Language, it's a small difference in language development with girls and boys, but there's enough of it that it can make a difference. So okay, I think when you had COVID, yeah, go ahead.
That's one of the topics that came up many times, was feeling like their boys are immature and not wanting to grow up, not eager to get their driver's license, not really anxious about what's coming next after high school, apathetic. One mom said, just this constant procrastination and lack of organization. So I know those are all over the place, but it all falls under this sense that your boy isn't where they should be.
And what I write about and my message is, your boy is exactly where they should be. Maybe you're not where you should be in terms of expectations, and not even expectations, but worry. There's so much pressure on all kids, but on boys these days. The whole college application process has just gotten so intense and so out of control, partly just because of the Common App and being able to apply to 12 or 13 schools rather than the 4 or 5 that you or I might have applied to on our typewriters. So I think that boys are where they should be, and one of my the message I like to push the most is, you have to parent the boy that you have at this given time. It's true for girls too, but they're going to grow and they're going to develop. And the hardest thing for a parent is not to project into the future and worry about what is my 15-year-old boy going to look like in the future, because they're not going to be 15 when they're 22. They're going to be 22, and they'll have gone through all the maturational process.
Yeah, well, the part of that is, if only I could have the crystal ball, because for some kids, 22 still looks like 16 because they've gone down a bad path. So I think part of this whole parenting gig is the uncertainty And that, when people say just trust that your kid is where they should be right now, that was always really hard for me as a parent.
I think it's really hard. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's the best way to parent, because then then you have the better chance of helping that 16-year-old to become the 22-year-old, because you're parenting them where they are now and you're giving them what they need now, which is a combination. It's really hard to parent boys. We have to give them we have to hold them accountable and give them unconditional love at the same time. We have to give them limits, and we also have to give them expectations and autonomy. So it's a hard line to walk, but I think if you're able to understand where you're going, because it's the minority of kids, right? We're always worried, the line is, will my kid end up, living in my basement? It's really the minority of kids that end up doing that. Most kids do not. And the kids that do have a different kind of problem than the normal teenage boy: procrastination, lack of motivation, lazy. It's just those kids tend to have more problems, and they haven't even, most kids will say, I don't want to apply to college. I'm only going to apply to a few, whatever, but they do. They need to be pushed, but they do. There is a small percentage that don't, but that's I don't think what most people have to worry about.
Okay, so this one is very particular, but we've been hearing about it a lot lately, is this driver's license thing. Like, what's going on there? And that's for boys and girls.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. It is really interesting to me, because it does seem to be a phenomena. I see it in my practice with some of the kids I work with. I think it has to do with overparenting. I think it has to do with kids feeling just more comfortable having their parents drive them places than needing to go through what now feels like a hassle to get a license and to learn how to drive and to pass another test. I don't really know. I know when I got my license, it was like the most exciting thing in the world. I'm sure it was like that for you. I think kids feel like they maybe, that their parents can fill in, and they have other ways to have their own independence. I could postulate maybe social media, maybe all the private stuff that they do on their phone gives them a sense of independence and separateness from their parents, so they don't need to drive anywhere. I work with a lot of teenage boys whose social life is sitting in the basement playing video games with their friends, and parents are like, they're on the video games all the time. They are, but it's also their social life. They are socializing. They're just more comfortable in their basements with their snacks, and then eventually they get out of the house.
I don't know. All I know is all 5 of my kids were at the DMV the day they turned 16, like knocking down the door to be the first in.
Mm-hmm.
So something's changed, definitely changed. Okay, so one of the issues that parents really asked about was this idea of their kids not talking about their boys not talking about their feelings. And so with so much depression and anxiety and so many things to worry about, and you don't have a partner in that, because you say to your kid, are you okay? And they don't want to talk to you about it. So I think a lot of the fear is, how do you figure out as a parent what's like normal sullen boy, and what do you do in those situations?
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 questions there. The first question is, how to get boys to talk about their feelings, or why boys don't talk about their feelings. And I've thought about this one a lot, because we talk about how we socialize boys, and we give them all these messages: big boys don't cry, grow a pair, shake it off. The message that we're giving boys is that they don't have to learn the basic important skills of how to negotiate their feelings, how to understand their feelings, because they're not going to need them. They're not going to need to understand their feelings. They should just push those feelings down, push them away, because our stereotypical, not even toxic masculinity, just masculinity, is being stoic, being capable of dealing with every situation, never showing emotion. And my message isn't that we want to make boys into girls, right? We don't want to make them so much more in touch with their feelings that we're taking away something about their masculinity. My message is, what I think is important is, if we stop telling boys not to have their feelings, they're going to have their feelings. They're just going to come up, because people have feelings, because it's normal and natural. And we spend so much effort telling boys not to feel anything that I think we really take away something that they really need in terms of their own emotional development and in terms of connecting to other people. Now, notice I haven't used the word vulnerability. That's really what it's all about. And it's about, how can we help boys to be vulnerable? But I don't think we have to focus on that. I think we just have to give them the message, it's okay to have feelings, and stop telling them not to have their feelings. And I think that they will evolve and they'll develop. In terms of the other issue, in terms of sullenness, there's normal development, and girls go through this too. It's just that girls gain status by who they know, by who they connect with. Boys gain status by what they can do, how far they can throw a football, how funny they are. So girls are more in tune with and available to talk than boys are. But a lot of teenage girls don't talk to their parents either. That's a normal part of development. And that, especially in 14, 15-year-olds, there's this pulling away that happens. There's this need to, the psychological term is individuate, to become your own person. And what happens with teenagers is the pendulum swings too far in the direction of, my parents are stupid. You have to drop me off at the corner so no one thinks I have parents. All those crazy things. And they're not going to say anything, or they have budding sexuality. They don't want to have anything talked about because they don't want to, they don't want to approach that subject. And so as they become more secure in their independence and who they are as teenagers, not adults, but as teenagers, as sexual beings, as knowing that they're moving towards leaving home, then they open up a little bit more. But so some of this sullenness is just normal. And it's frustrating, and it's hard to lose that, scrumptious kid who would just, crawl into your lap and tell you everything. That's sad. As a parent, in order to win, you have to lose. And that's just the reality of it. But I think that when a kid when there's a noticeable change, when you notice that they were one way and now they're just completely a different way, when you see if they were social and they're not as social, if their grades, go down, all those kinds of markers that might suggest that there's something else brewing besides normal adolescence and kind of rebelliousness, that's when it's important to kind of pay more attention. And boys do talk. There's a controversy. I've heard people like me say you should talk to boys when they're in the car. And I've heard other people say you should never talk to boys when they're in the car because you're going to hold them captive, and they don't want to have a captive audience. I think that parents have to know, it's usually when you're about to go to bed that boys want to start talking, but they do talk. It's just you have to get them at the moment when they're willing to open up. And we don't have time to go into it today, but in order to get boys to listen to you, you have to listen to them. They have to know that you're hearing them. They have to know that you are able to see the world from their perspective, see how the world makes sense to them before they're ever going to talk to you about what their world is like. And I think it's also important. And, I go into this in the book, and a lot of people have written about it. And I have a new book, by the way, which is called the He's Not Lazy Guide to Better Grades and a Great Life. And it's a workbook for parents and teens. And I talk about it there too, is you don't just having empathy, understanding how someone is feeling doesn't mean you're validating it. It doesn't mean you're agreeing with it. Someone can say something, a teenager can say something, crazy, like my teacher hates me, my teacher doesn't know anything. You can empathize with that and understand why they think that without necessarily agreeing with it.
Okay, so I want to go back to what you said about we don't have to tell our kids to be vulnerable. We just have to not tell them to suppress their emotions.
Mm-hmm.
We're fighting against a culture that sends that message. So do you think that if we do it better in our homes, we can kind of counter culture this?
I do. I think that I think it's our only option, there are coaches out there that are really positive and really give good messages to boys in terms of how they should develop. And they understand that the role is not just to win a football game, although that is a goal. It's also to develop young men, and those coaches probably don't give that message. There are other coaches out there that give really, I think, harsh messages that are not only damaging to boys getting in touch with their feelings, but also damaging to their self-esteem. I've dealt with those situations recently. So I think at home, I think we really can do that. And I think a lot of it is modeling. And this is where, fathers come in, or male parental figures in different people's families, because the more that a man can model having feelings, expressing feelings, the more that a wife can tolerate her husband doing that, because it works both ways. And a lot of women, they don't feel so. They want their husband to be that stoic guy. They don't necessarily want him to be crying on their lap. And that's not necessarily what I'm advocating. But I think that the more the parents can model that, and the less messages they give, the more boys can grow up. Every family has their own set of values that kids grow up with. This can just be one of them.
So some of the answers that I found really surprising and interesting were, I guess my bias in that I think boys have an easier time socially than girls do in middle school and high school. But a lot of the comments were about like boys being afraid of dating and not knowing how to quite do it, wanting desperately to fit in, feeling the same FOMO that we kind of more attribute to social media and girls. And Mean Girls came up a few times, that like the boys don't know how to navigate the more sophisticated, like kind of mean girl stuff that goes on directed toward them.
Susan, you pack a lot into a question or into that's what I love about you. But yeah, so to break it down a little bit, I mean, first of all, as I said before, boys and girls get status differently. Men and women do too. So from a young age, girls are socialized to get status by who they know. And this is part of what leads to the mean girl phenomena, because when you're a teenager, your social status is derived by who you're friends with, who your network is, who likes your Instagram posts, who doesn't, who can't, all those things. And that's not where boys get their status from. There certainly are cool guys and not so cool guys, but it's more about what they can do. It's more about who's the best athlete. I said that before. Who's the funniest? It's not about who got the violin solo or who got the lead in the musical. It's about these things that boys have to prove themselves. Video games. So I think that boys, it's more underground, but it is certainly there. And so they're as worried about being accepted. It's just that they express it differently. I don't know if boys are more intimidated by girls than they used to be, in terms of asking girls out or whatever. The social mores have changed a lot. We can get into that, but in terms of what's acceptable. But I also think that, when I was at this school a couple of weeks ago, as I said, the Brownie School in New York City, I had some questions to ask the boys, like you have questions to ask me. Here's what they didn't want to talk about my questions. They wanted to talk, the younger, the middle school kids, they wanted to talk about social media. And they kept going back to it. And I was really surprised at how much it impacted their sense of social well-being and security, because they really felt like it had its positives and they were clear about that, but it had a lot of negatives for them in terms of body image. I never used to hear boys talk about whether they had a six-pack or not, and all of a sudden it's about being fit, it's about how they look, it's about their abs, and the increase in eating disorders among boys has also been noticed. So I think that's all due to social media and how we look. So I think there are more pressures like that are affecting boys just as much as they're affecting girls.
It's interesting because we kind of always divided up the conversation, like girls were social media and boys were gaming. And is it because gaming is has turned into being social, or is it that boys are actually on social media?
I think that they are on social media, and maybe not in the same way that girls are, but I think it's more so. Even a few years ago, I would ask boys, do you ever post? And it was like, no, or I post something stupid I did. But I think that they're watching. And I also think that, they watch a lot of YouTube, and that's a different kind of media, and Snapchat. They're always snapping each other. That becomes the way to communicate for especially younger teenagers. And so there are pictures that are always being, of each other that are putting up there. So I think they're engaged in social media, and just the internet in general. One of the boys said, the internet can show you everything, and sometimes there are things that they see that they're not ready for, they don't want to see. It's just all out there. So it's not just social media.
Okay, so this is like just parenting, but we asked the question about boys specifically. But when the communication in the family is just gone bad, right? Like you're wanting the conversation as the parent because you just listened to Dr. Price and he suggested having these conversations, and you're in the car, you heard the car was a good place, and your kid is literally silent the whole drive home. Then they get in the house and they're rude to everybody. I mean, it happens, right? Like kids behave that way. And as parents, it's so painful to not be able to kind of drive the conversations that we're told are it's important to have them.
Well, yeah, these are age-old issues in terms of raising teenagers. This is all part of normal development, as I said before, that teenagers go through. If they're surly all the time, if they're overly rude, limits need to be set. You shouldn't tolerate kids calling you names or being rude all the time. But you have to have some stomach for it. But I still think there are opportunities for conversations to happen because families are together. And again, I know I may be a broken record, but I think if it's one thing that I want parents to take away from is, what I said before, kids have to know that you're listening. They have to know that you respect their opinion, their perspective, and it's empathy. But empathy isn't just, again, it's not just understanding how someone feels. It's understanding their perspective and how their perspective makes sense to them. And I think that that's where you start. And so a conversation should be asking questions, from the parent. We always want to start with, well, you should do this, or I hope you do that. We want to give them advice. We want to give them, save them some pain, but we really need to understand where their head's at. And in order to do that, you just have to listen. As a therapist, I've been trained when someone comes into my office, an adult or a kid, and they say, an adult, I have news, I have a promotion. My first instinct is to say, congratulations, that's wonderful. That may not be how they feel about it, right? And so as a therapist, I have to say, wow, how do you feel about that? And then I'll hear either it's wonderful, and then I'll say congratulations, or I'll hear I'm scared to death, I don't think I'm ready. And then I'll say, okay, good, let's talk about that, right? So it's the same thing for a parent. It's just asking questions, asking more detailed questions. The worst question, there's who, what, why, where, and when, right? What we learned in English class in 10th grade, asking why something happened is a bad question. You're never going to get a good answer because it's going to put someone on the defensive. Asking how something happened will get a better answer, even though it sounds just like semantics. So it's just figuring out how to ask the question, listen to the answer. It may be minuscule, but just then say, oh, so you just told me nothing, right? You just told me that that school was boring. Oh, okay. And then you ask a little bit more, but they need to know that you heard what they said before you start to say, no, school is not boring.
I think it pushes everything we grew up with out. You have to say goodbye to this whole notion that we're in charge, that, they're going to walk in the door and we're going to ask them questions and they're going to politely answer because they're so delighted to see us at the end of the day. And it's like, it feels exhausting when you tell me all the things we have to do.
Well, first of all, that may be the house you grew up in. It's not the house I grew up in.
There was a top-down feeling when I was a kid.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that that's changed in any way. Parents are still the boss, they're still the authority. We still set the limits. Kids need limits, when limits are set, development happens. If we don't set limits, our kids are going to go off the rails. We need to let them pull the engine, but we need to set the rail. So I'm not talking in any way about letting kids do whatever they want or not guiding them or not setting expectations. I'm just talking about having a conversation where you're letting them talk and know that you understand, because, by the way, you're going to have a heck of a lot better chance of setting limits that are going to make sense, or understanding what to say to them and what advice to give them when you really know what's on their mind. So it's really just about it's about a different way perhaps of having a conversation. I don't think it's about authority. I think it's about our need to help. I think it's about our desire to keep kids from experiencing pain. We want to say, oh, if you just do this, everything will be okay. Or please do this so that you'll be successful as an adult, because we're worried about them, because we want them to thrive, and we feel the same pressures that they feel. But you and I didn't need our parents' advice any more than your kids or my kids needed our advice before we know what's on their minds. Right?
Okay, this is a really hard question to answer, but I want to ask you, because a few times you've said, we still get to put in place boundaries. In fact, we should. But when our kids don't do that, it's like,
when they
I
don't do
don't,
bad.
you
Is that
know,
what?
we've said to a kid, like, here's the responsibilities of being a member of our family, like chores or whatever else it is, or curfew or whatever else it is. When the kid isn't the compliant kid and doesn't do all those things, which in my house was almost all of them,
Mhm,
what's the
mhm.
language like in this kind of listening to them and being empathic and all those things? What's the response to a kid who just says, no, I'm not doing that?
That's a whole different issue. It's a whole different conversation. It's a whole different thing, because that's not a what's on your mind. Let me kind of, pick your brain. You don't need to pick a kid's brain about why they missed their curfew or why they're not emptying the garbage. Which are, listen, if any of your viewers have figured out how to get kids to clean up, their socks or to take out the garbage, let me know, because I think that's really challenging. And part of the chores thing is, I kind of put that in a different category. I think we have lost some battles, and if you don't have your kids start doing their chores when they're little, and you try to impose them when they get to be older, you probably the culture is already set. Madeline Levine, who wrote about affluent kids, has a line. Don't treat your kids like royalty, who are expected to bring pride to the family. Make them throw out the garbage, but you have to do that when they're younger. But if they break a curfew, they need a limit. They need to be grounded. And what you don't want to do is get into a power struggle. And so sometimes that happens. If a parent has been setting consistent limits all along, the teenager may balk, but they're going to follow the limits. And if they give you the finger on their way up to the room, that they're just saving face as long as they're going up to their room. And of course, different families have different values about that. So I'm not, but it's just not to get it to escalate. But if a parent hasn't been setting limits and now they need to, or the kid hasn't needed it, but now they're really testing it, the thing is to avoid a power struggle. So, like you said, you broke a curfew, you're grounded. No, I'm not. I'm going out. Right. Okay. So if you say, yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. Your teenager is going to win. I promise you, because they don't have as much at stake they have more at stake in terms of their independence and their autonomy. That's what they're fighting for. And they're not going to worry about, swearing at you or losing decorum or whatever, because they feel safe. Hopefully they feel safe with you, that you're not going to, lose your control of yourself with them, but they're going to lose their control with you. So anyways, so you give them a choice. Well, I set this limit, you're grounded. You can't go to the party tomorrow night. If you go, here's what's going to happen. Then this will happen. Then, you'll lose the car for the week. So you can either not go to the party tomorrow, or you can lose the car for the week. It's your choice. Then you have to let them go to the party, but you also have to then take the keys away. It's the choice that allows them to then feel like they're actually making a decision. 9 times out of 10, they won't go to the party. If you have a kid who is totally defiant and is never listening to you, that's a kid who needs help. That goes back to what we were talking about before. That's a kid I would take to therapy or try to get some extra help with, because that's a different situation.
I think one of the things you said in there was the best parenting advice I ever got, which was that when they're walking away and they give you the finger or mumble something under their breath, that it's literally saving face for them. They've lost everything in this power struggle. And that changed my parenting and my relationship with my kids so much. That was amazing. Can I give one of the questions that we got from somebody here?
Yeah, please. But let me just say, that is an example of understanding from their perspective, right? That's seeing the world from their perspective.
Yeah, but I wouldn't have done it if someone hadn't said, because I
Right.
felt like you're not allowed to talk to me like that, like this whole kind of holier than thou. And yeah, it was a really big moment. So I don't want my son to vape and smoke weed.
Yeah. Yeah, nobody does. I I would ask the parent how they feel about alcohol, because my experience is that parents are much more comfortable with alcohol than they are with marijuana. Um, and because they grew up with it, because it's part of our culture, the way that marijuana is not yet, but it's becoming. And I think that all the same rules apply. In fact, I think in many ways, and I'm not saying that you should let your kids get high, it's the same thing. You set limits. But I think marijuana is not as dangerous as alcohol. I don't think it's physically dangerous. I think when kids get drunk, they get into fights, they get someone pregnant. When kids get high, they kind of sit on the couch and giggle. And I know that those are extremes, but I think that it just doesn't bring out the same behavior. So and I used to feel differently, but I think that when kids are under your roof, it's probably a better time for them to experiment than when they go off to college. I didn't used to feel that way, but experiment doesn't mean here's a beer or a joint. Experiment means you're not allowed to do this. And then if they do it, either set a limit or say the next time there's going to be a limit and set a limit. We still need to set limits because that's holding them back. I have this metaphor that we build a fence around the kids, and as they get older, the fence gets bigger, right? But we never want it to be too high that they can't jump over or climb under every once in a while, because that's how they learn. But we need to have the fence there. So I think that I think marijuana is going to present all sorts of problems, just like alcohol does. But I think it needs to be dealt with in kind of the same way. I'm less afraid of it in some ways, even though I think it can be dangerous. I'm not saying it can't be. So I think that we need to set limits, but probably abstinence is unless you live in a culture or a family where there are religious values where kids are going to follow that because it's how they were raised, they're probably going to experiment a little bit. Vaping is just bad. I mean, vaping is today what cigarettes were when we were kids, but it is, it's easier to use and it's more insidious. So I think it's a fine thing to forbid kids from doing that. And, then you're into the struggle to get their vapes and everything, but they get really addicted to the nicotine.
Yeah. No easy answers to those. That risky behavior stuff is just tough. Dr. Adam Price, thank you so much for being here with us. You are always so helpful. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.